Wind in the Willows, Chapter 4, Mr. Badger, Part 1. They waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last they heard the sound of slow shuffling footsteps approaching the door from the inside. It seemed, as the mole remarked to the rat, like someone walking in carpet slippers that were too large for him and down at heel, which was intelligent of Mole, because that was exactly what it was. There was the noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes. "Now, the very next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up." "Oh, Badger," cried the rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow." "What, Ratty, my dear little man," exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you at once. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never. Lost in the snow, and in the wildwood too, and at this time of night, but come in with you." The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The Badger, who wore a long dressing gown and whose slippers were indeed very down at heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw and had probably been on his way to bed when their summons sounded. He looked kindly down on them and patted both their heads. "This is not the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come along. Come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything." He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the lights, and they followed him, nudging each other in an anticipating sort of way, down a long, gloomy, and to tell the truth, decidedly shabby passage, in a sort of central hall, out of which they could dimly see other long tunnel-like passages branching, passages mysterious and without apparent end. But there were doors in the hall as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors. One of these the Badger flung open, and at once they found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large fire-lit kitchen. The floor was well-worn, red brick, and on the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs. Between two attractive chimney corners, tucked away in the wall, well out of any suspicion of draught, a couple of high-backed settles facing each other on either side of the fire gave further sitting accommodation for the sociably disposed. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards placed on trestles with benches down each side. At one end of it, where an armchair stood pushed back, were spread the remains of the Badger's plain but ample supper. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room, and from the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. It seemed a place where heroes could fitly feast after victory, where weary harvesters could line up in scores along the table and keep their harvest home with mirth and song, or where 2 or 3 friends of simple taste could sit about as they pleased and eat and smoke and talk in the comfort and contentment. The ruddy brick floor smiled up at the smoky ceiling. The oaken settles, shiny with long wear, exchanged cheerful glances with each other. Plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf, and the merry firelight flickered and played over everything without distinction. The kindly Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. He then fetched them dressing gowns and slippers, himself bathed Mole's shin with warm water and mended the cut with sticking plaster, till the whole thing was just as good as new, if not better. In the embracing light and warmth, warm and dry at last, with weary legs propped up in front of them, and a suggestive clink of plates being arranged on the table behind, It seemed to the storm-driven animals now in safe anchorage that the cold, trackless wildwood just left outside was miles and miles away, and all that they had suffered in it a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted and Badger summoned them to the table where he had been busy laying a repast, they had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread before them, they really it seemed only a question of what they should attack first, where all was so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they had time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The Badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows up on the table, or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had gotten an idea that these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. We know, of course, that he was wrong, and he took too narrow a view, because they do matter very much, though. It would take too long to explain why. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked or at anything, and he never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so-and-so, or ought not to have done something. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight as was decently safe, and that by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered around the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after all, they had chatted for a time about things in general. And Badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the Rat gravely, while the Mole cocked up on the settle and, basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all that the rest follows." "How many has he had?" inquired the Badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the Rat. "Oh well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th, and as for the others, you know that coach house of his? Well, it's piled up, literally piled up to the roof, with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. That accounts for the other 6, so far as they can be accounted for. He's been in hospital 3 times, put in the Mole, and as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of." "Yes, and that's part of the trouble," continued the Rat. "Toad's rich, we all know, but he's not a millionaire, and he's a hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of law and order. Killed or ruined. It's got to be one of the two things, sooner or later." "Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we do something?" The Badger went through a bit of a hard thinking. "Now look here," he said at last, rather severely. "Of course you know I can't do anything now." His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep. All are weather-bound, more or less, and all are resting from arduous days and nights during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. "Very well then," continued the Badger, "but once the year has really turned, and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, you know. Both animals nodded gravely. They knew. Well then, went on the badger, we, that is, you and me and our friend the mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand, will stand no nonsense whatsoever, will bring him back to reason by force if need be, will make him a sensible toad, You're asleep, Rat. Not me, said the rat, waking up with a jerk. He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper, said the mole, laughing. He himself was feeling quite wakeful, and even lively, though he didn't know why. The reason was, of course, that he, being naturally an underground animal by birth and breeding, the situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home, while the rat, who slept every night in the bedroom, at the windows of which opened on a breezy river, naturally felt the atmosphere still and oppressive. Well, it's time we were all in bed, said the badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks. Come along, you two, and I'll show you to your quarters, and take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please. He conducted the 2 animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half the room. Piles of apples, turnips and potatoes, baskets full of nuts and jars of honey, but the 2 little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked so soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the mole and the water rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. In accordance with the kindly badger's injunctions, the 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late next morning and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet and ducked their heads respectfully as the 2 entered. There, sit down, said the rat pleasantly, and go on with your porridge. Where have you youngsters come from? Lost your way in the snow, I suppose? Yes, please, sir, said the elder of the 2 hedgehogs respectfully. Me and little Billy here, we was trying to find our way to school. Mother would have us go, and the weather was ever so, and of course we lost ourselves, sir, and Billy, he got frightened, and he cried, being young and faint-hearted. And at last we happened up against Mr. Badger's back door, and made so bold as to knock, sir, for Mr. Badger. He's a kind-hearted gentleman, and as everyone knows. I understand, said the rat, cutting himself some rashers from the side of bacon, and while the mole dropped some eggs into a saucepan. And what's the weather like outside? You needn't sir me quite so much, he added. Oh, terribly bad, sir, terrible, deep. The snow is, said the hedgehog. No getting out for the likes of you gentlemen today. Where's Mr. Badger? Inquired the mole, as he warmed the coffee pot before the fire. The master's gone to his study, sir, replied the hedgehog, and he said as how he was going to be particularly busy this morning, and on no account was he to be disturbed. This explanation, of course, was thoroughly understood by everyone present. The fact is, as already set forth, when you live a life of intense activity for 6 months in the year, and comparative or actual somnolence for the other 6, during the latter period you cannot be continually pleading sleepiness when there are people about or things to be done. The excuse gets monotonous. The animals well knew that Badger, having eaten a hearty breakfast, had retired to his study and settled himself in an armchair with his legs up on another and a red cotton handkerchief over his face, and was busy in the usual way at this time of the year.